You stay here. Her eyes wide open, her mouth painted bright red and gaping as she shouts angrily. Suddenly feeling anxious, I desperately asked questions to try and suppress this feeling. Where is this place? Did you come to play at this house? You're going with me, right? However, the woman, glaring down at me, shouted, "Shut up." Meanwhile, a man looks on emotionlessly, his eyes pitch black, hidden in the shadows. These unemotional two are my parents. 30 years ago, when I was just 6 years old, my parents abandoned me. On that day, they suddenly took me to an unfamiliar land, in front of an unknown house. Just minutes before, I had been excited about my first outing with my parents. As I pushed the intercom, my mother turned her back as if to flee and headed towards the car. Realizing instantly that I was being left behind, I clung desperately to my mother's arm, shouting, "Wait. I'm coming with you." But she shook me off as if I were something filthy. Without even a glance at me, struggling on the ground, unable to stand, my mother got into the car and drove off. The smell of the car's exhaust gas intensely stung my nose. Trying to chase after the car, I struggled to stand up, but it was difficult for me, born with only one leg. While I struggled to get up, the car quickly disappeared out of sight. I trembled with fear, unable to move. I struggled to breathe. I wanted to go home. Where is this place? That was the last memory I had with my parents when I was 6 years old. 30 years have passed, and I haven't seen my parents. I don't intend to see them. Protecting this life I have now is what matters most. If it's for protecting our family's peaceful life, I can do anything. I'll make myself so happy that I can completely forget about that day. I am Ashley. Born without a right leg, but I have been able to live happily for 36 years. I can do the job I love, and every day is very fulfilling. This is all thanks to my grandfather. I am not grateful to my parents at all, because they abandoned me. My mother called me a monster. I have little memory of my childhood, but what I occasionally remember is the sight of my mother's back. Was it inside the house? Or was it a dimly lit room where a bright red curtain slightly swayed in the breeze by the window? I was lying on the floor. Thirsty, I tried to go to the faucet to drink water and lost my balance and fell. As I collapsed, my cane rolled away. At that time, I couldn't put on my prosthetic leg by myself. So when I was at home, I used a cane to balance and move around. Since I didn't have much strength in my arms yet, I couldn't stand up and desperately wanted my mother to pick up the cane for me. However, she turned her back and didn't even look at my hand reaching out for help. It was unbearable for her that her daughter was not like other children. At that time, I believed it was my fault that I wasn't loved. My father was hardly ever at home, so I have even less memory of him. Occasionally, when he was home, he acted as if I were invisible. Even if I was struggling to get up the stairs or reach the faucet, he would just walk past me or sit watching TV in the living room. He was indifferent to me. When I drew a picture of him and said, "Look, I drew Daddy," he would just respond, Whether I asked him to eat with me or showed him something, it was always just, I don't remember him ever making eye contact. In my memories, his eyes are always pitch black. My father's indifference must have influenced my mother's feelings towards me, at least to some extent. In a household where my existence was largely ignored. And just as I was about to start elementary school, my mother told me, "Ashley, we're going out today." I had never attended kindergarten or daycare, and outings were minimal. So the three of us had never gone out together. "Take this because we're going far," she said, handing me a bag with a few clothes. Until then, she had been concerned about my appearance and never even took me to the park. So when she mentioned going on a long trip for the first time, I was thrilled and filled with anticipation about where we were going. "Where are we going?" I asked, but my parents didn't answer. However, I was so captivated by the changing scenery outside the car window that I didn't mind not knowing our destination. From the back seat, I couldn't see my parents' faces. But I remember seeing my father's stubble in the rearview mirror as he drove. I don't know how long we drove, but eventually, the car stopped. "We're getting out here," they said, and as the door opened and I got out, there was an old house.
Bye.
Then, my mother said, which suddenly made me anxious. I quickly asked, "Aren't you coming with me, Mom?" "Dad, where is this place? Are you and Mom going somewhere?" However, as usual, my father averted his gaze from me, and my mother only said, "It's all arranged." When I rang the doorbell of the house, my parents got back in the car and drove off before the house's occupants could come out. I stood there dumbfounded, staring at my departing parents' car, completely unable to understand what was happening to me. Where is this place? What is this house? Why was I brought here? I was paralyzed with anxiety, fear, and a sense of loss when the front door opened with a click. "Hello, who is it?" said a face I recognized as it appeared. It was my grandfather. Since my mother was concerned about my appearance and didn't take me out, I had never been to this house before. But I remembered my grandparents well because they had visited my home. It was because the warmth and kindness I felt from my grandparents at that time was the first human warmth I had ever experienced. I have strong memories of feeling cherished by someone. "What's wrong, Ashley? Where are your parents?" The moment I heard my grandfather's voice, I couldn't stop crying. Grandfather looked around, seemed to sense something, and gently embraced me. It was only with the warmth of his hands that I could finally express my feelings. "Mom," she drove away in the car. "I want to go home. It hurts." Seeing my pain, my grandfather's face saddened, and he hugged me tightly and stroked my head. "It's still cold outside, Ashley. Let's go inside." He gently took my hand and led me into the house. I still remember the warmth from his large hands. It's okay," he said, almost as if reassuring himself. My grandfather made me a warm drink. I remember feeling my body warm up from the core and the tension in my muscles relax. "Is this all your luggage?" my grandfather asked, which made me wonder briefly if I couldn't go home. However, at that moment, the warmth inside the house and the gentle voices of my grandparents gradually calmed me down. I fell asleep that night between my grandparents, who stroked my forehead, and slept until nearly noon the next day. From that day on, I lived with my grandparents. A few days later, I was surprised to hear my grandfather raise his voice on the phone for the first time. "Are you even a mother?" After hanging up, he told my grandmother. Imagine how sad Ashley would be if she knew her parents had abandoned her. From the tone of his voice, it seemed like my grandfather was on the verge of tears. So I quietly went into the room they had prepared for me. I had a vague feeling about it, but at that moment, I fully realized that I had been abandoned by my parents. Since then, enveloped in my grandparents' kindness, I was gradually able to forget the sadness of being abandoned. Warm meals, warm words, and a warm room in the house made me feel truly happy for the first time. My grandparents cherished me and supported me all the way to university. They participated in school events and watched me strive and enjoy myself with gentle smiles as if it were their own happiness. My grandparents are my pride. High school and university were a bit far from my grandparents' home. And they were over 60 years old, so even though I said, "You don't have to push yourselves," they always came to see me perform, saying, "Ashley's big day, we're going to see it. We want to see it ourselves." To me, my grandparents were like my real parents. There are no parents for me other than my grandparents who cherish me more than anyone. I owe my grandparents an unpayable debt. I had decided that when I became an adult, I would definitely repay this kindness. After graduating from university and receiving my first salary, I prepared a meal and a gift. "This is such a fancy restaurant, it's my first time here," my grandparents said with a shy smile. Which made me overwhelmingly happy, and tears came to my eyes. When I toasted with my grandfather, he said with blushing cheeks, "To think I'd get to drink with Ashley, what a happiness. Thank you for letting me go to university. I was never lonely because you were always there with me. And I was so happy you always participated in the events," I told them. To which my grandfather responded with a big wave of his hand in front of his face. "Ashley's smile is our source of energy. We did it because we loved to," he said, hiding his embarrassment. His eyes seemed a little teary at that moment. When I handed over the teacups I had prepared as a gift, he said while laughing, "To think Ashley bought these with the money she worked hard to earn, it feels too precious to use." He held the teacups and stared at them for a long time. "It has been 30 years since my parents abandoned me. It has been 30 years since I started living with my grandparents and became a family of 3. Since becoming a working adult, I have been working desperately to repay my grandparents. Even if it meant cutting back on sleep and having no free time. Working towards my goals never felt too hard. In my 20s and 30s, I put all my effort into my job. I took any job that would make money. Instead of spending on my own entertainment, I saved. And this year, I finally achieved my goal of buying a high-rise apartment near a station. That is convenient for my elderly grandparents to live in. Life in the high-rise seems to satisfy my grandparents. And we are able to live a peaceful life every day. One day, as I was thinking about what else could make my grandparents happy, something unexpected happened. On a holiday morning, while drinking coffee with my grandparents in the living room, the doorbell rang. The monitor showed a middle-aged couple. I had no idea who they were, but my grandfather looked at the monitor and showed his anger. "What are you doing here now?" After hearing his voice, I looked at the monitor again. Those eyes. I remember them. They always turned their backs on me, but when angry, my mother's eyes would widen and glare, and my father with his black eyes. "Go away. We have nothing to talk about with you." After saying this, my grandfather turned off the intercom and went into his room. But the parents shown on the monitor did not seem to be leaving. Ding dong, ding dong, ding dong. The chime was pressed over and over again. And I could see the suspicious eyes of other residents of the apartment in the monitor. Thinking that this would bother other residents, I decided to respond. "There is nothing to discuss, so please leave." Despite my firm statement, my mother did not back down. She stared intently at the monitor. Her big red mouth looked as if it could swallow a person. Next to her, my father, with his pitch-black eyes, was muttering something, but I couldn't hear what. "I won't go back until we talk. Let me into the house now." In the entrance, without caring about the public eye, my mother yelled, "Anyway, there's nothing to discuss. Really. If you moved to such an apartment, you should have contacted us properly. If I hadn't heard from Danny, I wouldn't even know where the family home is." The tone of her complaint was something I recognized. Danny is my grandmother's brother. My grandmother had 2 siblings. And I had given him the new address as a contact for emergencies. I hadn't told Danny in detail that I had been abandoned by my parents because he lived near my parents' home. I refrained from discussing the situation to ensure that no harm would come to Danny. Really. I had to pretend to be Danny's niece on the phone to get this info. He's so hard of hearing. He didn't even realize it was me and blabbed about how you're living in such a nice place now. And how happy that must be. Laughing out loud while talking about how she deceived someone. My mother seemed to have lost her sense of decency as a person. If you're earning enough to live in such an apartment, you should give us some money. She said to me as if it was the most natural thing. When I responded, I cannot give you money, her expression changed drastically. What? What did you just say? Who do you think raised you? She exclaimed in anger. So I told her, my grandparents raised me. Then she cursed me, you ungrateful thing. How hard it was to raise someone with a body like yours. Pay back the money it took to raise you until you grew up. It's only natural to repay your parents. She pressed on, to which I replied, I don't remember being raised by you and Dad. My real parents are my grandparents, and I refused her demands for money. Hearing her continue to rant through the intercom, my grandfather came out from the back room. What is all this noise about? I told you to leave. Grandfather shouted at her. When mother yelled back, we raised this child, so she should repay us. The usually gentle face of my grandfather filled with an anger I had never seen before. You raised her? Don't you remember what you did to this child 30 years ago? You abandoned this little child in an unknown land. Have you ever thought about how she felt at that time? When I held Ashley, she was trembling. How lonely she was. How scared she was. How anxious she was. Then mother said, but thanks to that, she grew up well enough to earn so much. It was all thanks to us. And your grandparents weren't lonely because of it. So she should be grateful. She rambled on with nonsensical excuses. Grandfather sighed in disgust. Do you still not realize that you are tormenting yourself with the seeds you've sown? When we found out you were pregnant, we told you to quit drinking and smoking for the baby's sake, but you didn't listen. After Ashley was born, you continued to drown in alcohol and cigarettes. When we went to see Ashley and held her because she was so adorable. Even Ashley smelled of cigarettes because you smoked that much. As my mother moved, the smell of cigarettes wafted from her. And with it, memories of my childhood home began to emerge. The smell of my mother's cigarette smoke mingled with the breeze that fluttered the red curtains. Turning around, I saw the glowing tip of her cigarette in her mouth, brightening with each breath she took. As I tried to walk, I stumbled over multiple cans and bottles of alcohol and fell. The pink carpet turned red as it soaked up the spilled alcohol. It was like a sea of blood. When the alcohol spilled, my mother's eyes widened and bloodshot as she yelled furiously, throwing a can at me. My father was indifferent, even as I was hit by the can and grabbed by the hair. He sat in the dim living room, piling more cigarette butts onto an already heaping ashtray. Behind him, gray smoke filled the air. Occasionally, ashes fell from the overflowing ashtray. As these memories resurfaced, and my parents' faces became clear in my mind, I felt nauseous. What's the big deal? There are plenty of people who smoke and drink. Why am I the only one you blame? Mother wouldn't back down. Yes, there are many people like that. But, you often neglected to take care of Ashley because you were drunk. You wouldn't notice when Ashley fell because you were asleep. And you often didn't feed her when she was hungry. Ashley was always bruised. And it was so bad that neighbors worried and even reported it, you know? We had to move because of the rumors, even though she wasn't taken into protective custody. Mother couldn't find words to argue and instead belligerently demanded, just let me in anyway. It's ridiculous to have a conversation like this without even showing your face. Standing at the entrance. At that moment, a police officer appeared from behind. What's going on here? We received a report of a suspicious person and arguing voices from a resident here. Mother, trying to play it off as a family dispute, said, "It's fine, it's just a family matter." But my grandfather stated, "She is trying to extort money from us, please take her away." The officer seemed unsure of how to handle the situation. Mother was determined not to back down until I gave her money. Thinking that this could endanger my elderly grandparents, I also spoke up to the officer. "I am being subjected to financial extortion. I am this child's mother," she asserted loudly. "She is indeed my biological mother, but since she abandoned me 30 years ago, the parent-child relationship has been severed," I replied. "I was explaining that you are not a resident here, and that your presence is causing a disturbance to the residents, so I asked you to leave." Despite my calm explanation, my mother could not contain her anger and screamed loudly in front of the police officer. "This ungrateful monster of a daughter. You should be grateful just for being born. With that appearance, living in such a place. If you come out, I won't hold back." Mother began to kick the automatic doors of the entrance violently. Seeing her rampage, a police officer intervened, and my father muttered quietly, "Please, spare us." The police then subdued my rampaging mother, saying, "Calm down. Let's go to the station." I could see her being taken away by the police, reluctantly. From behind my forcibly removed mother, my father's figure appeared smaller than before as he shuffled along, shoulders hunched and hands fidgeting weakly. Later, I received a call from the police, explaining my parents' situation. After abandoning me, they attempted to start an online shop. But with my father's background only in clerical work and my mother's dislike of work, they lacked the skills to manage or sell effectively and failed miserably. They had accumulated a significant amount of debt and tried to get financial help from me, their daughter. It seemed that they were only warned by the police at that time, but they soon came to visit again. They watched our apartment from a park across the street all night, saying, "We've waited all night, let us in, and give us the money, and we'll leave." There were also letters stuffed in. "Pay up. Deposit money into this account. Don't forget the favor of being born. You really aren't worth living." Eventually, they even resorted to blackmail-like tactics, demanding I sign as a guarantor for their debts, prompting me to consult a lawyer I knew. The lawyer said I could sue for threats and emotional abuse. He prepared official documents to send to my parents. "Do not approach our family at all. Do not request money. If these conditions are not met, we will sue legally and demand compensation." I wasn't interested in the compensation, I just wanted to keep my parents away immediately. That's why the document included the possibility of demanding compensation. This strategy was effective against my financially struggling parents, and they stopped coming to our apartment. I was able to focus on my work peacefully. I am a writer, and my unique experiences and perspectives, shaped by my disability and the treatment by my parents, enable me to excel in my field. Most importantly, the immense love I received from my grandparents is a major source of inspiration in my writing, especially in children's literature, conveying the warmth and kindness of people. My children's books are pioneering a new genre, recently becoming a topic of discussion. Therefore, I have been asked to appear in the media as Ashley, increasing my public appearances. I don't use social media myself, but in recent times, celebrities' pasts are often revealed online without their control. Likewise, the fact that I was abandoned by my parents and raised by my grandparents became widely known without my consent. While I have come to terms with my past, the public reaction to this revelation has led to significant criticism of my parents. Burdened by their debts, they were forced to work day and night, leading a hellish life. However, their workplace was local, and it quickly became known that they were my parents. The public scrutiny and criticism were intense, and they faced discrimination at work, making their employment untenable. As the attention on me increased, so did the criticism towards my parents, eventually leading to their dismissal from work under contrived reasons. Completely unable to make ends meet, they attempted to visit me again. I was unaware of their visit because they were stopped at the entrance of my high-rise apartment by the security guard. Just as famous as I am, my parents were recognizable to anyone as my parents. Therefore, they were identified immediately by the security staff. "What's wrong with a mother wanting to see her daughter?" my mother shouted. But the security guard decisively replied, "There is no need to let you in." In fact, after the previous disturbance, I had already informed the security company not to let my parents through. I wanted to avoid any danger to my elderly grandparents. With no worry of my parents visiting, we could live very peacefully. Since then, my parents, unable to live in areas where they were known, disappeared into a place where no one knew them. However, cornered and without any reserves, they blamed each other for their situation, fighting and demeaning each other daily. Rumors suggest that even my father has succumbed to drinking and smoking, and both have engaged in gambling. Addicted to gambling, they couldn't even pay off their debts and were constantly on the run from dangerous people. Meanwhile, I continue to write novels quietly in my room in the high-rise apartment, surrounded by numerous photos of my grandparents. In this room, I feel the comfort of being enveloped in their kind smiles. Countless photos of my grandparents, who always attended my school events because they wanted to see Ashley's efforts, inspire me. I strived because I wanted to see their smiles. Their smiles are my motivation. And my next publication is a work I am confident about because it is inspired by my beloved grandfather. It features a hot-blooded hero, much like my warm-hearted grandfather. Once this book is completed, I plan to go on a trip with my grandparents. I always infuse my work with the warmth of my grandparents. And when the work is complete, it becomes another way to repay my grandparents, which is also a reward for myself. Though my grandparents are aging, they are still very active, going out for walks daily and having coffee with neighbors. I hope to continue living a peaceful life with them for a long time.